At a time when so many of us feel like our connections with people are distant and conversations surface level, really engaging with each other takes intention. I'm Ashley Gould, the founder of Attend, an everyday luxury home brand with products that set the table for meaningful spaces and gatherings. Our podcast builds on those spaces through dynamic discussions with open-hearted people, with the goal of sparking conversation around your table. In this series, we explore how designed spaces impact our lived experience and day-to-day life. Our aim is to help you understand what makes a space fulfilling and provide a scientific framework along with expert insights to help you create spaces that enhance your well-being. We delve into the entire spectrum of designed spaces, from our brain's relationship with aesthetics to finding the right designers, lighting systems, and objects that support your well-being. Ultimately, we examine how the spaces we inhabit can enrich our ability to be present and connect with others. Join us.
A quick note from the On the Table with Ashley team. This is part 1 of our 2-part episode, so definitely come back for part 2 in 2 weeks. Enjoy.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Professor Chatterjee. I'm extremely excited to kick off our series on neuroaesthetics with you. So thank you so much for taking the time.
I appreciate your inviting me to this conversation.
So could you tell us where you grew up and what kind of kid you were?
I grew up mostly in India. When I was 1 year old, we moved to Boston, but moved back to India when I was 5 and stayed there till about 10th grade. So I think the period that I was a kid was mostly in India. It was in Western India in a state called Gujarat, a city called Ahmedabad. It's a kind of hot, dry, desertish climate. I spent a lot of time outdoors. I went to a school that was taught by Jesuits from Spain. I spent most of my time running around, and besides that, I read a fair amount, and I also drew a fair amount. So I'd say between reading, and reading was special because we didn't have access to a lot of books. There was no TV. Radio was around. But I was mostly, I'd say, reading, drawing, and running around like a feral kid.
Did you have siblings?
Yes, I have an older sister who went to a school. My school was an all-boys school. She went to an all-girls school that was run by Carmelite nuns.
Okay, you had the Jesuits and the nuns. And it sounds like aesthetics were a part of your life from a young age if you were interested in drawing from a young age. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so. I think India is a very visually rich, actually sensorially rich country. I don't know if you or some of your guests have probably been there. Everything is very colorful. Things are decorated all over the place, from trucks to, cars, houses. Clothing tends to be very colorful. One of the common observations for people who move to America is that 2 things. 1, where are all the people? And 2, where's the color?
Yeah. You then decided to go to medical school. Can you just take us a little bit on your journey to how you ultimately ended up specializing with a focus on neuroaesthetics?
Yeah, I went to medical school. I went to the University of Pennsylvania. I was there from 1981 to 85. And at the time, I wasn't sure what I was going to be doing, but I found that once we got to the neurosciences, that I really loved the content of what we were being taught. And this idea of this organ that gave rise to mind could be itself an object of inquiry was brand new. And in the 70s, neuroscience was not a topic that was typically taught in undergraduates, so I had no exposure to it before then. So I wanted to become, that was the desire to become a neurologist, and then this question of becoming a cognitive neurologist, which is really trying to understand the nature of how our mind works, whether it's perception, emotion, action, decision-making, attention, all of that. And so that's how I started. I think the interest in neuroaesthetics began, I would say, around 1999 or so. So this was after I'd been doing work in cognitive neuroscience for a while. And at the time, there was almost nothing written about it. It started with old school research in the sense of, and I mean really old school. This is going into the libraries, walking the stacks, and looking at magazines to see what journals actually published anything that was relevant. And that's where it started. The field has grown tremendously. Up until about 10 years ago, this was something we always did on the side. I only had undergraduates do work. I didn't think it was responsible to have graduate students or postdocs do work in this because there was no field, there's no market for their services after they left. There weren't jobs for people who were studying neuroaesthetics. But the zeitgeist changed over the years, and if you look at the rate of peer-reviewed publications, before the year of 2000, there's virtually nothing. And I'd say about 10 or 12 years ago, there's an inflection point where things have really accelerated. And I think that fits with my own experience, and especially, I'd say, in the last few years, the broad interest in neuroaesthetics from outside sciences, from young people especially. On average, I get 3 to 5 emails a week from random people wanting to talk to me, wanting me to read something, wanting to connect in some way. It's overwhelming, but it is a measure of this increasing interest in the domain, primarily driven by young people, I would say.
Interesting. Okay, so let's define neuroaesthetics.
Neuroaesthetics, as to be very literal about it, is about the neuroscience of aesthetic experiences. So it, in my view, is a subset of cognitive neuroscience. And cognitive neuroscience is a discipline by which we ask questions about how various human experiences and cognition, emotion, perception are organized in the brain. And within those, that catalog of experiences, aesthetic experiences, is one fundamental aspect of what it means to be human, what it means to live in the world. And so it becomes its own domain of inquiry within that framework. So we are interested in the aesthetics of people, for example, beauty. Why do we think some people are more attractive than others? Of the environment, landscapes, why some places feel more compelling than others, but also human artifacts. And that would include architecture and these peculiar artifacts that we create that we call art.
When do you spend the most time with the people you love? For us, it's at home, around the dinner table with family, or sipping cocktails in the living room with friends. So why not make that time even more meaningful by imbuing your gatherings with pieces that not only make connecting easier, but spark conversation around your table? Amaton's collection of small batch, artisan, quality-made pieces for tabletop and home are not only made for simple serving, they're works of art designed for daily use. Whether you're hosting a dinner party or sitting down for family game night, our collections create a sense of presence and peace in every home. Shop our collection of dinnerware, drinkware, serveware, and more at amatond.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com. Gather by design.
Yes. And so you said sort of 2000 as like a demarcation point when people could start to read about or conduct more research in this area. And I think that I read that the phrase itself was coined in the 1990s. I'm not sure if that's accurate or not. But I also think that this concept of neuroaesthetics and really studying our brain in an environment has been around as long as humans have. We just haven't thought about it or given it a label. And we've only more recently begun to study it to understand it. Do you think that that's fair?
Yeah, I think it's partly fair. So the term neuroaesthetics actually goes back to the 1980s.
Okay.
And just as a term, in a relatively obscure place, so most people don't know that. The interest in trying to understand aesthetic experiences using biologic measures goes back to the 1970s. There was quite a well-known psychologist named Daniel Berline who talked about this and wrote about this. And then even before that, you can go all the way back to Edmund Burke, who was interested in this. And so while there has been several thousand years of history of interest in aesthetic experiences, the specific piece of linking that to some biologic or physiologic measure is relatively recent.
So that is really the main change over time. And can you talk about how you do that? And I know that you conduct research in your own lab, and obviously you're aware of research that others are conducting. So can you tell us a little bit about the state of that research and how that's evolved since you've been involved with it?
I think of it as an experimental science, and that's an important piece of this, which is that we take seriously what people in the humanities have to say. We take seriously what artists think, that the intuitions people have, what philosophers have written about. But people's intuitions, however insightful they are, for us are the starting point, not the ending point, right? So it's kind of the old sort of Reagan byline for your audience who are old enough to remember this: trust but verify. So we're in the verification business. So just because you're super smart and you've given a lot of thought about this and you think this, that's great. That gives us a leg up on where to start, but that's the start, not the end. And so in my lab, we spend a lot of time thinking about what the right question is. And it becomes a mantra in the lab, which is the question is the question. We might spend weeks figuring out, really, we have this idea of this general domain in which we're interested in. What's the question? How can we nail it down? How can we refine it so that it is both a useful question and one that is tractable given our methods? Not all questions are, and
right.
We make no claims that we have. There are no imperialistic claims here. We're not saying that we are the be-all and end-all, but if you're going to play the science game, this is how you do it. So I would say what has happened since the early 2000s, so in 2003, I published a theoretical model, and in 2004, there was a group in Vienna that published a theoretical model, and it was the first time people had kind of tried to lay out what are the steps, what are the components that go into an aesthetic experience. And what that allows people to do is to say, if I'm going to conduct an experiment, this is the piece of the framework of the model that we're looking at, because you can't do everything. And so that was the beginnings of a kind of formalization. I would say the first 10 years, people were still trying to find their footing. I wrote a paper in 2011 titled Neuroaesthetics, a Coming-of-Age Story. And it was really kind of, more and more people were getting interested in. There was a community that was starting to build, which is very, very important for any scientific movement, that were in communication with each other. We started to write papers together. And so the kind of sociology of this is also interesting, of how a relatively small group of people who, importantly, liked each other. And that was critical, that we didn't cannibalize each other, when we were early in this. So that was important. I think the early phases were asking relatively simple questions of, what kinds of things do people find beautiful? Do people find architecture beautiful in the same way that they find other things beautiful? What kind of consistency is there in people's responses? There is some work in that same period I had written about what happens, and this is going back to my roots as a neurologist, what happens to people when they have brain damage under some conditions of neurologic disorders. There are some instances where people's art actually gets better. Notion, if you think that art and the production of art is among the highest of human capacities, how is it possible that you can have an improvement in this ability with brain damage? It doesn't happen with language, it doesn't happen with emotions, it doesn't happen with decision-making, and so on. And I should make a disclaimer, which is that I'm not saying that brain damage is good for your artistic production, right? So if you're an artist, don't go bang your head around to get to be a better artist. However, there are instances where people's art gets better. I would say the kinds of things that have happened, that have changed, is a reflection of changes and improvements in technology and our conceptual frameworks that applies across the board in cognitive neuroscience, not just in neuroaesthetics, and neuroaesthetics kind of, takes advantage of that. So with brain imaging, particularly functional MRI, the kinds of analytic techniques that can be used has gotten more sophisticated. Rather than thinking of specific locations in the brain that might be implementing a kind of process or a particular state, the shift has been towards thinking about different networks. So in the brain that, you can think of different locations, but you can also think of it as different networks. There has been more sophistication of trying to understand the context in which people are engaged with aesthetic experiences and how context modulates the experience. There is more statistical sophistication in how people are doing things. So there are notions of they're called exploratory graph theory, semantic network analysis. These are just fancy buzzwords, and very smart people who know math much better than I can do this stuff. But it gives us insights into how concepts are organized or experiences are organized across groups of people. That's been a change. I think one of the important pieces is that we've started to go beyond asking questions of beauty and saying, what is the nature of aesthetic experiences, right? It's not just beauty. You can have, people will pay, Halloween was not that long ago. People will pay a lot of money and go and watch horror movies. That's a kind of aesthetic experience in which somehow being terrified becomes part of an aesthetic experience. People used to talk about the sublime, which was an important construct. And in the sublime, there is a kind of beauty, but part of it is also a feeling of being overwhelmed and feeling small in relation. There's a bit of anxiety in there, and that becomes part of an aesthetic experience. I would say in the last few years, our lab and a few other labs have been asking the question of, it's almost what's beyond beauty. And we have established a taxonomy of a vocabulary to talk about aesthetic experiences. And there's a whole kind of line of research that we've done to establish that taxonomy. But the analogy, to make this a little more concrete, would be if you take the example of wine tasting or bourbon tasting or any fully flavored sensorial experience, most people can say that they like it or they dislike it or they find it interesting. And then they get stuck with, really trying to identify what is behind that liking or disliking. But if you have a sommelier who starts to give you a vocabulary, starts to point out things like, there are hints of vanilla, or there's berries, there's a caramel finish, or, so on and so forth, once given those words, people can identify those elements of their experience. And so we think something similar can happen with aesthetic experiences, which is if people are given a vocabulary, they can query themselves and start noticing what it is underlies their liking or their disliking or their apathy. It could be apathy. This idea that there are layers to these experiences, and how do we categorize those layers? How do we label them? I think that's been something that has, I'd say in the last 3 years, has been a hot topic. And it allows us to ask different kinds of questions because now we have a tool which we can take to different domains to ask, what is the difference between experiencing art in a museum versus digitally?
Right.
What is the experience? One of the things we're quite interested in is you can think about it as slow looking. I would put this in a broader category of slow movements, slow eating, slow walking, slow looking. Many of us, I'd say, live in a very fast-paced, highly transactional world where we're rushing from one thing to another. I think the digital world has not made this any easier. If anything, it's made it tighter. And we've lost the ability to slow down and to be in the moment. Experimentally, what has been shown, not by us, but other people, if people go to museums, so you have a select group of people that are actually going to a museum. Mm-hmm. They stop at a work of art, so it's a specific piece that they've chosen to stop at. The median amount of time that people spend in front of that work of art is 27 seconds.
Really?
And some of that is spent reading the panel or whatever, the plaque that gives you some descriptors. So you ask yourself, what can you get out of something where someone is looking at a work of art for 20, 25 seconds? And I think the reality is that most people don't know how to slow down. We might rush to go, as I do, to the gym in the morning, and maybe you've noticed nothing in the 5 blocks that you walk to go to the gym. And that idea of how do you pause, how do you slow down, how do you savor moments, I think is something, those are daily opportunities that people are passing by. And one of the things we're looking at in the context of art is, can you get people to slow down, look at art, give them tools to look at art, and try to get a sense of, is this changing their experience?
Right.
You try to get a student to look at one work of art for 15 minutes without pulling out their phone. I'm telling you, it is not easy. It is not comfortable.
Well, this whole idea of the taxonomy is so interesting to me. I think that, so if you have your wine analogy and you have a sommelier who's explaining to you how to label what you're tasting or experiencing, that it can often heighten your experience. And I think, or I suspect the same might be true, generally speaking, with your environment. So, and this sort of, to me, is, I think, the heart of what's so interesting about neuroaesthetics, which is, it's fascinating to study it and to read about what you're studying. At the end of the day, and I'm interested in sort of what I don't know if an ultimate objective is something you even have, because maybe it's just curiosity and inquiry. But if there is a way to create this taxonomy and then create an awareness among people about what they can do to optimize their environment for their well-being, I think that would be a huge gift to humanity. And I think, and I don't know if you have a thought about this, but some of us are more in tune sort of automatically to our environment, and we pay more attention to it. And as a result, we cultivate it. And some of us pay less attention and cultivate it less. I don't know if there's any research that shows if that difference has an impact on people's sort of well-being or their consciousness or the way that they move through life. But I believe that we all could become more in tune to what is right for us. And maybe that is first learning the right vocabulary and the right way to ask questions to inquire about the right environment for us.
Yeah, I think I mostly agree with everything you said, trying to go back to where you started. And, Aristotle said all knowledge begins with wonder. And so that kind of curiosity, wonder is something that really drives what we do and drives many scientists in what they do. Just sheer pleasure of gaining knowledge. And this is also, it's worth pointing out, itself is an aesthetic experience. When you look at infants, for example, when they solve a problem, their face lights up with joy, right? Gaining knowledge or solving something is a joyful experience, right? It's an aesthetic experience. So, and scientists are sometimes, there's a caricature of scientists, kind of like Dr. Spock or something like that from Star Trek, very rational, very cold. My experience as scientists are very emotionally driven by what they want to do, and the ones who aren't burn out in their 40s and 50s, they're out of the game. Right? Mm-hmm. So there is that. The way I think about this domain is like any science. There is a basic science, which is asking fundamental questions. What is the nature of this experience? How does it get implemented in the brain? How does it affect our behavior, and so on and so forth? And there's a translational aspect, which is, okay, now as we're learning this, what are the applications in the world? And I think that's part of what you're getting at. And I think those are just as important, and they feed off of each other in the sense that sometimes people can jump to applications without having the foundational knowledge, and that has its own risks. And there are risks of just staying in the laboratory and never finding out if these ideas actually make sense when you take them out in the wild. So we are interested in that whole range. So in these examples, you talked about the environment, and we've been interested in the built environment and how that has an impact on us. As there's a way, I think, in which the lockdown in particular made this more salient to people, that while it was always there, all of a sudden when people were confined and couldn't leave, couldn't move, there's a sense that people started noticing, oh, I've had that work of art up there for 20 years, I haven't changed it, that paint on that wall is really looking like it needs a change. And in a way that I think was made much more explicit. And those are kind of trivial examples, but also the way in which the kind of social disparities became very clear. So kids who, for example, didn't have a quiet place to be on their Zoom classes or online classes, as opposed to, kids from families of means where they could have a private room to do that. So I think like the effect of the built environment on day-to-day living became much more explicit during the pandemic in a way that has made it easier. I'm not saying, I don't mean to trivialize that time, but it's made it easier for us to make the case for why this is important, because people have an intuition about it in a way they didn't before. I think your question of sensitivity is an interesting one, and one that we think of it as a kind of, the question is of individual differences, which is that why do some people react in certain ways and other people in different ways? There are a few things to consider. One is there is a personality construct that is called openness to experience. And this is within, probably the most common ways that psychologists carve out personality is called a 5-factor model, of which openness to experience is one of them. And it is what it sounds like, that some people are much more inclined to enjoy new things, be exploratory, and other people are quite conservative in their, I don't mean politically, but conservative in, what they will engage with or encounter. Fairly consistent finding is that people who score high on openness to experience also are much more inclined to engage with their environment, with art, and explore those kinds of experiences. The second is the past experiences people have had. So people, when they've had more exposure to art or more exposure, whether it's through their family or the kind of the culture they're in, they also tend to be more engaged as opposed to people that have grown up and just have never had that kind of exposure. So I think there are some ways in which people differ. We think that especially the second, right, is malleable, right? You can, and we've found this, that you can, if you take the example of art, one of the most common findings is that people who have no prior exposure to art don't understand and sometimes even get offended by abstract art. Like, why is this art? My kid could do this. This is kind of the caricature of a line that people have. But just a little bit of education, just a little bit of knowledge, some contextual information goes a very long way, especially for people who've had little exposure to art. And so you can see how education might be an important component to this. We did one study looking at American art and South Asian art, looking at people in America and people in India looking at this art. And the broad finding is that when people don't have a lot of exposure to art, there's an in-group bias, that they tend to prefer the art from their own culture. I mean, it turns out that Indians know more about American art than Americans know about Indian art, but that's a whole other story. However, and if people have exposure to art, you don't see the same kind of in-group bias. It's as though they've sort of transcended or gotten past the kind of cultural markers. But if in both contexts, if you give people a little information about the artist, the context in which it was made and things like that, that kind of cultural divide starts to go away. And so it also suggests that, this is a small study, but suggests that art with a little bit of information might be a vehicle to bridge cultural differences in a world where, we are faced with massive fragmentation based on culture at this point. So that's a kind of optimistic view of how art could be used.
I also think there's a much more basic sense of art, which is that whether or not somebody has the education, there will be something that they're attracted to for some reason. Maybe it's cultural or maybe it's not. It could be created art, or it could be something in nature, or it could be walking into a room. Like we were talking about paint color during COVID. I actually don't think it's trivial. I think that color can move people and they may not even know it, So, but then if they enter into a room with a color that moves them, they will feel it. And so I think, how can we get people to better recognize and inquire and determine, like a sommelier will help you figure out what wine your palate enjoys, like what colors make you feel, I don't know, whether it's peace or whatever the emotion is, or maybe it's different emotions for different things. For, when you're working, you want a specific kind of environment. When you're at home, you want a different kind of environment. This idea of neuroaesthetics is something that all humans can relate to, but all humans don't know about it. So is there a way to make it a bit more mainstream and something people can access that's more intuitive to them?
Yeah, every time you ask one of these questions, I find my mind going off in 3 different directions simultaneously. So, which is a challenge to my working memory to hold all those in mind at the same time. So I'm going to start and I'll meander around and hopefully I'll get to most of the things you've said. So one of the things we're interested in doing right now is even asking the question of what are aesthetic experiences and deconstructing a notion of what art is. And we're doing this. We got some support from the National Endowment for the Arts for doing this. And partly it's because we have especially if we're talking about fine arts, we have a kind of, in my view, a narrow view of what art is. And it comes from kind of 17th, 18th century European intellectuals, which doesn't apply to much of everyday living and to much of the world. So the NEA does these surveys. I can't remember the frequency with which they do it, and sometimes end up thinking, for example, that underrepresented minorities in the U.S. don't participate in the arts in the same way. Well, that's predicated on an idea of what art is. And so if you, for example, go to a chamber orchestra, that's participating in the arts. But if you go to your church and listen to the choir, somehow that's not participating in arts. And, it's not clear, immigrants that tend to go to community festivals, that might not be regarded as art, as opposed to going, paying $120 and going to a concert somewhere. So, I think this idea of what we have decided is art or is an aesthetic experience itself is worth at least re-examining.
Yeah.
It becomes more complicated with the advent of the digital world. So, people have access to art collections from around the world, sitting in their own homes. And, so now you don't have to be a relatively wealthy American to fly to Florence to go to the Uffizi. You can sit in your home and look at some of these images, right? So there's a democratizing effect of that. But is that also an aesthetic experience? Are things like, TikTok, Instagram, are those aesthetic experiences? And so you can go on and on. So what we did was we reconfigured large survey that we're conducting now and are analyzing, where we look at different kinds of activities that we think could be regarded as aesthetic. It could be gardening. This is another thing that happened during the pandemic, where people really, sort of gardening became huge.
Yeah.
Are these both on the production side, the output side, and on the input side? And in the analog, the real physical world, and the digital world. So we sort of created a whole survey of that to try to get a better sense of who is doing what kind of thing. And so we're analyzing those data, and I'm pretty excited about how that might play out. And it might be that it's not the case. I mean, there are some things we would anticipate that young people might be more engaged with digital media. But in the preliminary look, it turns out that older people also, like as people get older and are more perhaps physically infirm, that they start, being more involved with digital media as well. Yeah. So there might be a kind of a U-shaped curve around that. So that's one thing we're quite interested in. To reconceptualize what an aesthetic experience is, and it's not just fine arts. Your question about in a very practical way, can people then become more in tune? Let's talk about the environment specifically. So one of the things, and this is not part of the taxonomy project, but in a parallel line, we were interested in how do we understand basic psychological constructs of people's response to their environment. And a curious thing coming from the outside has been that architects, who are among the smartest people I've met, they think about space in fantastic ways. I mean, I spent a good bunch of my career thinking about spatial cognition. Architects are great about how to configure space. In the last 20 years, they've been really thinking about sustainability and materiality and our the building's relationship to the environment. All fantastic. What has been a blind spot, I think, is they don't think about people. Is that the idea that the buildings are for people, and that if you're going to build for people, knowing something about human psychology and human neuroscience might actually be useful. And it seems like a huge blind spot. And in all fairness, architects are coming around to that and are being more explicitly aware of that. But in a long history of architecture, that has not been emphasized. So we have found, without going into sort of the gory details of the studies, that our response to the built environment can be distilled into three major components. And the labels for those components are coherence, the second is fascination, and the third is hominess. And we have found that even when people are unaware that they have neural responses to these components, and so going to your point about this is affecting us whether we know it or not, or whether we're explicitly aware of it or not, it's affecting us. And just to give you kind of a brief intuition about what those terms mean, because I think please. This becomes very easy for people to grasp onto. So coherence is a kind of rational approach where things are very organized. You look at a space and you know exactly, why things are where they are, and it's all, often you think of rectilinear spaces and, spaces that are very clean and organized as a kind of sense of coherence. Fascination has to do with the informational complexity in the space. Like, are there things you feel like you want to explore? There's moments of interest and you want to really engage with it. And hominess is this basic feeling of, do you belong in that space? Yeah. Right? Are you in your skin? Is this where you feel comfortable? And those three things can vary with each other. You can be in a perfectly coherent and fascinating place and not feel at home. And so I think those three things, sometimes when I give talks, I have people think about those, and like every space they're in, just stop and look, and what's your assessment? Is this a coherent space? Is it a fascinating space? Do you feel at home here? And it starts to become automatic that you start noticing that. And of those, a couple of things. We talked about individual differences. One of the things we find is that people who are on the autism spectrum don't respond in the same way to fascination in the way that neurotypical people do. And our guess is, we haven't tested this directly, but our guess is that that kind of information becomes overwhelming. So instead of evoking a desire to approach, to explore, it becomes repulsive.
Interesting.
And hominess, I think, is one that probably will vary from people to people, based on your own background, the kind of climate you grew up in, the kind of climate you're in. And that's the one, in some ways, is, to me, one of the more interesting pieces of this, which is what gives people a sense of being completely comfortable at their best self. And, and these are early days, so, very little ongoing research on this, right? We're just starting to lay out the landscape of these questions.
So if you have these three elements, and it may be too early to have a sense of this, is one more important than the other in terms of the potential outcomes you could have in a space? So I think about, for example, on one extreme you have like the DMV, where there's neither coherence nor fascination nor hominess, right? And my personal feeling is I just want to get out of there as quickly as I can. But people go there and they have to work there every day. And how is that affecting them? Is that affecting them more or less than me because they're less aware of it? Or is it in some way affecting them potentially negatively over a period of time and they can't change it? Well, you can choose where you work, I suppose. But I guess it kind of comes down to that. Like, do you foresee a world where we're so aware of these three elements that we could literally turn down a job because it's not coherent for us, or one or more of these elements is more important, and we know that it will have a negative effect over time on our well-being?
Yeah, I'm kind of imagining a cranky DMV person who is so pissed off, and you're just the next person in their gray cell. So a couple of things. I think the way those three components play out is likely to be different in different kinds of buildings, because buildings have different functions, right?
Right.
So, and again, this is now me speculating based on this, not that we've done work on this. You would imagine, as someone who flies a fair amount, you want airports to be coherent, right? You don't want to get there and, try to figure out, how to get to the next terminal, and, it's impossible to figure out. Airports, I would say to their credit, more recently have had, secondary to coherence, have moments of fascination. There's this whole movement of having local artists in airports, which I think is fantastic. You can pause if you're not in a rush, pause and look at that stuff. But I would say areas of transportation, you want them to be coherence to be prominent so people can get to where they need to get to. I could imagine commercial areas being high in fascination. The old department stores, would have you kind of meander through, and you can't figure out how to get out of there because they want you to keep exploring and exploring, right? And it makes sense if you have the time. So, and hominess, would be, and there are sort of admixtures of these. Clearly, where you live, you want it to be homey and you want it to be as comfortable as possible. Work is an interesting thing. People are having a hard time after the pandemic getting people back to work. And, you could ask why. What is it about the workspace that is not inviting for people to come and work? We are social creatures, right? We want to be around other people. So you've already got that working in your favor to bring people into work. And yet many people don't want to go. And you have to ask yourself, what is it about the environment? I have a fantastic office on Penn's campus. It's a building that was designed by Louis Kahn, who's a famous architect. And I have these huge windows and so much light, and looking over a small interior park. Even in lockdown, I used to go to work because I like working here and I like working there. And so, I and one other person were the only two people in the whole building during lockdown. But it was because I love my office. It's a great place to work. So, I think the kind of questions you're asking make a lot of sense. Hospitals are another good example, right? The hospitals are typically not a space that conveys care, right? Yeah. They convey high technology, but there's certainly things that could be done better. We have a project, and this goes back to the kind of the pragmatics of all of this research. How does it play out? We have a project in a place outside of Washington, D.C., a substance use disorder facility called Alpas in La Plata. And we helped design the whole place, but we primarily focused on 2 rooms that we're calling refresh rooms, where we used some of our findings from the work on architecture and the built environment. And the idea is that both patients in recovery and staff, when they want to, can go into these spaces for up to half an hour and, basically replenish themselves. And we're collecting information on their states before they go, after they go, some physiologic measures. And that's trying to be very explicit about what I think your intuition and mine is as well, is that we implicitly experience these things, right? But can we take a population that is especially stressed and use this as an intervention, the space as an intervention for their stress, their anxiety? And, last week was we just collected the first participants. And so over time, we'll have some data on that. But, you have to do it one step at a time. And so, but that's the nature of the beast.
That sounds so fascinating. Can you share what you took in some of the learnings to make the physical refresh rooms?
Yeah. So one of the words that you and many of your listeners will be familiar with is biophilic design. And just if someone doesn't know what that is, the idea is that we have an innate affinity to nature. The term itself was initially coined by a psychoanalyst named Erich Fromm, and then the biologist E.O. Wilson really popularized it. But again, as we were saying, the idea of aesthetics, the idea behind this has been around for a long time. Just the term biophilic design,
right.
It's a more recent one, and those 2 men are associated with it. And sometimes when I give talks about this, I label it as we are an old brain trapped in a new environment. And what I mean by that is our brains adapted over the Pleistocene, over close to 2 million years, to a certain kind of environment that sculpted and gave form to what our brain is. And in the last 10,000 years, we now find ourselves in, and especially the last 100 years, especially the last 50 years, in an environment that is so radically different than that.
Yeah.
Right? And so we are typically in the kind of environments we live in urban metropoli, is that the plural? We're disconnected from nature for the most part.
Yeah.
And so what our research shows, again, using coherence, fascination, and hominess, is that we want more elements of nature inside. And nature is not an undifferentiated good, that when we go outside, we want some imprint of humanity. And so we think of the building as a kind of semi-permeable membrane, a little bit of nature in and a little bit of our order out. And that seems to be the sweet spot where people live. And feel the best. If you're a serious outdoorsy person, maybe that how far out you go gets further and further,
sure.
But that's kind of for most of us the sweet spot. So what does it mean to bring elements of nature in? It can be very concretely that the materials are natural materials. It can be plants. It can be natural light. It can be the nature of the light. An anathema to me of so much of office spaces are overhead fluorescent lights. It is the most repulsive kind of lighting you can have, and it's everywhere. What we did with this was Oh, and then there are patterns of nature. So people have talked about abstract patterns, for example, fractal patterns. Patterns are self-similar that are seen in nature, but they don't have to be, just the patterns themselves are something we respond to. So what we did in this space, these two spaces, was take these elements. We have plants in there. We have art that are mostly about nature. We have natural colors. We have the ceiling tiles with a slightly blue tint. So even though you don't realize it, it feels like there's sky there. It feels more open. We have wood on the walls. There's some evidence to suggest that you don't want too much because it can then become claustrophobic. So we've done that. We're very careful about the textures and the feeling, right? What things feel like. We have a video monitor in there where we had a rather well-known nature documentary maker who donated these nature videos, about 25 minutes worth for us. And we have another company that works on music, sort of calming music as the background. And we're not saying people need to watch these, but these are the options. And so people can come in, and basically we've done this. So 2 weeks ago, my postdoc went down there and we started collecting data. So here's something very cool. They did about 5 of the residents in this place. Everyone, when they got to the threshold, took off their shoes and walked in barefoot. We have a nice rug in there and stuff like that. This was not something they were told to do or anything, but everyone did that.
Fascinating.
And most of them in the 25 minutes fell asleep in there. And we viewed this as not a bad thing. I mean, it's like these are hyped up people, and they just get in there and they seem, it seems as though they're so relaxed, they get relaxed enough to fall asleep. So again, these are very early days, and these are just a few observations. But hopefully we'll be able to demonstrate the efficacy of this kind of space in more substantial ways as more data comes in.
I love this project, and I also love that you can collect data over time and then publish on it, and then spread the work that way.
Yeah, I mean, to your question of how can this be, the way. So the currency for us is peer-reviewed publications.
Agreed.
And that has to be the foundation. And then, I write a Psychology Today blog. I appear when it's possible on podcasts or interviews like yours, so that this word can be amplified and people know about it. And increasingly people are learning about it, but there's a long ways to go. And I think where your question is, how can this be delivered in a way that people can own it? People can themselves start using it. And that's something I think is important. And hopefully over time that will happen. Yeah.
Well, I think just all of the work, and then as you publish it, some mainstream media will pick up what they find to be interesting, which will get more people interested. So I think it will just sort of grow over time. And I really do think that projects like this one are a cornerstone, because you will be able to show with data over time what impact these kind of spaces are having. And then that in turn can teach architects and interior designers and lay people like myself what we can do in our own lives. And I think little things can have a big change personally. So like that coat of paint, I think can really make a difference in how you feel. If you enjoyed the show, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening. It helps us reach more people who just might need these conversations. If you have ideas for future guests or have feedback, You can reach out to us by visiting onthetablewithashley.com, linked in the show notes. On the Table with Ashley is presented by our elevated everyday home brand, Amatand, which you can find at amatand.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com. You can follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Amatand.